My name is Susan. For as long as I can remember, my family has told me I was the disappointment. Not because I failed at school or at work. Not because I broke the law or wasted my life. Number. They said I was a disgrace because I chose to marry a man who works with his hands. To them, respect meant wealth, love meant status, and success was measured by the car you drove or the letters after your name. When I walked into their house with Mark, my husband, a mechanic, they laughed behind their glasses of wine. They looked at his boots, at his old truck, at the oil on his fingertips. They thought I had thrown my life away. For years, I stayed quiet. I nodded. I smiled at the right moments. I let their words cut deep and pretended it didn't hurt, because keeping the peace felt safer than fighting back. But silence has a weight. It sits on your chest. It grows heavier every year. And one evening, at a family dinner, I realized I couldn't carry it anymore. That night, everything changed. The house looked beautiful from the outside. Warm lights glowing in every window, cars lined up in the driveway, shiny, expensive, polished to perfection. A Mercedes, a Lexus, even a brand new SUV with dealership plates still attached. Mark parked our old pickup truck a block away. He turned to me with that crooked smile of his, the one that always said, "We'll be fine." I forced a smile back, though my stomach was tight. I checked my lipstick in the visor mirror, trying to steady my hands. The air smelled of fresh grass. Houston evenings are warm in the spring, soft with the sound of cicadas. For a moment, I wanted to stay in that truck. I wanted to drive back home, heat up leftovers, and watch TV with Mark, anywhere but here. Instead, I took a breath and stepped out. Mark carried the pie I'd baked, wrapped in foil, as if a simple dessert might buy us a place at their table. We walked up the sidewalk together. The door opened before we knocked. My mother stood there, holding a glass of wine. Her eyes flicked down to Mark's boots, then up to my face. She pulled me into a hug that felt stiff, staged, more for the neighbors than for me. "Well, you made it," she said. "As busy as you are with commitments." Her voice was light, but the sting was sharp. Inside, the house smelled of pot roast and lemon polish. Every surface sparkled, every picture frame straightened, every pillow perfectly placed. Perfection was her favorite mask. In the dining room, my sister Vera was already playing hostess. Her dress fit like an advertisement. She stood with her husband's colleagues, laughing too loudly, making sure everyone noticed the ring on her finger. When she spotted me, she smiled that tight Instagram smile. No hug, no words, just a glance, then back to her crowd. The table was set for royalty. White plates, crystal glasses, name cards in looping calligraphy. Hers said, Dr. Vera Campbell and Mr. Campbell. Mine said, Susan plus guest. I placed the pie down, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. Mark touched my back gently, steadying me. His hand was calloused, but his touch always reminded me of something solid, something real. He whispered, "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. We sat down. Conversation swirled around us like smoke. Vacation homes, promotions, new investments. No one asked me about my work. No one asked Mark about his life. Instead, someone joked, "Hey Mark, maybe you can take a look at the sink while you're here." A few people chuckled. Mark smiled politely. I laughed it off even though it stung. Just another small cut, one of many. Dinner moved to the patio, under strings of white lights my mother had copied from Vera's Pinterest board. Laughter bubbled over wine, stories of cruises and ski trips. I chewed slowly, praying the conversation would drift away from me, but it didn't. My mother lifted her glass, tilting it just so. Her eyes locked on mine. Her voice was soft, almost playful, but sharp enough to draw blood. "So? Susan, is this really the best you could do?" The table went quiet. My father set his fork down hard enough to rattle the china. "You're the disgrace of this family," he said, his face red. "All that schooling, all those sacrifices, wasted. for a man who fixes cars. The words hung in the warm night air. I kept chewing, kept my head up, but inside, I felt the familiar stone drop in my stomach. The silence thickened. Eyes shifted away. Even Vera looked uneasy for a moment before she smiled again, twisting her glass. And just like that, I knew. The night was only beginning. The sting of my father's words settled into me like a bruise. Disgrace. That word had lived in my bones for years. It wasn't new, it wasn't surprising. But hearing it spoken out loud at a table full of relatives was a wound I could no longer pretend to ignore. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, while my mother topped off her wine as if nothing had happened. My brother chuckled under his breath. Vera leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him smirk. The message was clear. They had decided who I was, and no amount of truth could change their opinion. I wanted to speak, to remind them who sat by my father's hospital bed when he couldn't walk on his own, to remind them who drove Mom to every doctor's appointment last winter, to remind them that I'd paid my own way through school, built a life on a teacher's salary, and never once asked for their help. But the words caught in my throat, heavy with years of silence. Instead, I sat there, chewing, swallowing, pretending my heart wasn't pounding in my ears, pretending my palms weren't damp against my napkin. I could feel Mark's hand brush mine under the table, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone, even if they wanted me to feel like I was. But memories came rushing back, uninvited. Every dinner table I had ever sat at with this family seemed to merge into one long, endless night of disapproval. I was 18 when I won a scholarship to study education. I came home with the letter, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. My father read it, then placed it down without a word. Finally, he muttered, "Why not law? Why not medicine?" My mother added, "Teaching won't bring honor to this family, Susan." I smiled politely, folded the letter back into the envelope, and carried the weight of their disappointment into my room. That was the first time I learned how silence felt safer than defending myself. When Mark and I got married, the church pews were half empty. My family sat stiff in the front row, dressed in their finest clothes, as if they were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. I heard the whispers, "He's just a mechanic." She could have done better. We cut the cake, danced our first dance, and I told myself it didn't matter. But later that night, alone in our small apartment, I cried into Mark's chest and whispered, "They'll never accept us, will they?" He kissed my forehead and said, "You don't need their acceptance, Susan. You only need the truth." Every holiday dinner was the same script. My siblings bragged about promotions, trips abroad, and new homes. Then someone would glance at me, waiting for me to add something worth sharing. When I spoke about my students, their faces glazed over. When I mentioned Mark's work, they changed the subject. Sometimes they didn't even try to hide their laughter. And now, here I was again, reliving every cut, every insult, every time I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. Except tonight, something inside me was shifting. The patio lights glowed above us, soft and warm, but the air felt heavy. No one met my eyes. The silence after my father's words stretched long enough to make even the cicadas outside fall quiet. Mark excused himself, rising from the table. "Where are you going?" Dad sneered. "Can't even sit through a meal?" A few relatives laughed. Mom swirled her wine. "At least you showed up, Susan," she added, her smile sharp, "even with your commitments." The laughter bubbled again, brittle and forced, but I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was the pounding in my chest, the voice inside me screaming that enough was enough. For years, I had believed silence kept the family together, that if I stayed quiet, I could protect some fragile version of peace. But sitting there under the glow of those patio lights, I realized the truth. The peace they wanted was built on my silence. and every time I swallowed the pain, I was handing them permission to keep cutting deeper. Mark returned a few minutes later, wiping his hands on the rag he always kept in his truck. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The moment he stepped back onto that patio, the laughter died. Vera's smile faltered. Dad's glass stopped mid-air. Even Mom's smirk slipped for just a second. They didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. And this time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. The night had already stretched too long. Every laugh, every sideways glance, every whispered joke had chipped away at me piece by piece. But when Mark stepped back onto that patio, wiping his hands on the rag he always carried, something shifted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He simply stood there, framed by the light from the hallway behind him. The chatter stopped. The wine glasses stilled. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. Mark's eyes moved slowly around the table. From my father's glare, to my mother's smirk, to Vera's frozen smile, and finally to me. I felt his gaze steady me, like a hand reaching across the chaos. Dad leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. Well? What now? Can't sit through dinner without running off like a boy? His words were sharp, baiting, but Mark didn't bite. Instead, he set the rag gently on the table, beside the crystal glasses and polished silverware, and folded his hands. You think I'm beneath this family, he said quietly, but I've been holding my tongue out of respect for Susan. Out of respect for all of you. The words landed heavy in the warm air. No anger, no trembling, just calm certainty, the kind that makes people listen whether they want to or not. My mother shifted in her chair, adjusting her napkin though it didn't need adjusting. Her hand trembled slightly, and she quickly reached for her wine glass to hide it. Vera's husband coughed into his fist, glancing away. Even Vera's fingers tapped lightly against her glass, the sound betraying nerves she never showed. You call me the help, Mark continued, his voice steady. Maybe that's true. I work with my hands. I fix what's broken. But that's more than I can say for what happens at this table. A murmur swept through the relatives. An aunt shifted uncomfortably. My brother rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but no one interrupted, because everyone could feel it. The balance in the room was changing. I looked at Mark and a memory flashed through me. The first time we met, I was stranded on the side of the road, my old car hissing steam into the Texas night. I was frustrated, tired, and close to tears. A truck pulled over and Mark stepped out. No judgment in his eyes, no condescension in his voice, just a simple offer. I can take a look if you want. He didn't want money. He didn't expect gratitude. He simply helped. That was who he was. That was who he still was, standing now in front of my entire family, unshaken by their scorn. My father slammed his palm against the table. You think this speech will buy you respect? The silverware rattled, and a few cousins flinched at the sound. Mark didn't move. No, sir, he said. Respect isn't bought. But before you call someone a disgrace, you should know who you're talking about. The silence that followed felt like a crack in the air, wide and irreversible. For years, I had been the one to swallow the shame, to keep the peace. But watching Mark now, calm, firm, unflinching, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. It rose in me like a spark catching flame. For the first time, I wasn't embarrassed by the man I married. I was embarrassed by how long I had let them treat him as less. Dad leaned forward, ready to fire back. But Mark lifted his hand slightly, not in defiance, but as if to steady the room itself. You've mistaken my silence for weakness, he said. But tonight, I won't stay quiet. Not anymore. The words dropped into the patio air like stones into still water. Ripples spread across every face around the table. Eyes darted, chairs creaked, and beneath it all, the realization was clear. The old script had ended. I looked around and saw it. Fear on my mother's face, unease in Vera's eyes. Even my father, red-faced and rigid, couldn't disguise the way his grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. Something had shifted, something irreversible. That was the moment I knew the night would not end the way it began. This was no longer about keeping the peace. This was no longer about being their good daughter. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. And I was ready to decide what came next. Mark stood steady, his rag folded neatly on the edge of the table like a flag of quiet defiance. For years they had mocked him, called him the help, whispered that I had married beneath me. But he didn't raise his voice, didn't slam his hand against the table. He just began to speak. When Susan and I married, he said, looking around the table, she was drowning in student loans. She never asked for help. She never complained. But I saw her check her bank account before buying groceries. I saw her tutor kids late at night just to cover the interest payments. The words landed like stones. I felt my face flush, shame and gratitude colliding inside me. I had hidden those struggles, worked hard so no one would see the fear in my bank balance. But Mark had seen, and he hadn't judged me. He had stood beside me. I paid off those loans quietly, he continued, not because she asked, but because her burden became our burden. Her fight became my fight. That's what love means. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes darting to me. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her wine glass shook slightly in her hand. And last year, Mark went on, his gaze shifting to my father, when Medicare didn't cover the bill from your hospital stay. Susan worried for days. She lost sleep trying to figure out how to help, but she didn't have to, because that bill was covered. Anonymously, my father's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He didn't ask who paid. He knew. That was me, Mark said simply, not because I wanted credit, but because it was the right thing to do. Because family should help family, even when respect isn't returned. The patio was silent except for the soft buzz of the lights overhead. Every face was frozen, caught between disbelief and guilt. And the lake house, Mark added, turning his gaze toward Vera. Her posture stiffened instantly. The plumbing that mysteriously fixed itself. The roof that stopped leaking. The wiring that was ready to cause a fire but somehow didn't. That was me too. I didn't send a bill because Susan loves that place. I wanted her to enjoy it without worry. Vera's smile cracked. Her glass clinked against the table as she set it down too quickly. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, running a hand across the back of his neck. Mark's words weren't angry. They were matter of fact, delivered with the calm of someone who had spent years doing what was right without asking for applause. I looked at him and saw the man I had fallen in love with years ago on a roadside in the Texas heat, the man who had bent over my broken-down car and offered help without expecting anything in return, the man who had listened to me, really listened, when I said I felt invisible in my own family, and the man who had told me softly, "You don't have to live for their approval, Susan. You get to live for yourself." That memory wrapped around me now like armor, and for the first time in years, I sat taller at my family's table. Dad leaned forward, his face red, his voice tight. "You think this buys you respect?" It was almost a growl, heavy with the frustration of a man losing control. Mark met his glare without blinking. "No, sir. Respect can't be bought, but I won't let you call me a disgrace while ignoring the truth." The silence after his words was so deep I could hear the cicadas in the yard, louder than the clinking of silverware or the shifting of chairs. My aunt fidgeted, glancing nervously at my uncle. My brother, who had spent the evening lounging smugly, leaned forward for the first time, his expression uncertain. Even Vera, usually flawless in her composure, stared at her lap. For years, this table had been a place of judgment, of silent hierarchies and quiet cruelties. But now the air was thick with something new. Truth. Uncomfortable, undeniable truth. I glanced around, my own heart pounding. I had always thought speaking up would end in chaos, in rejection. But watching my family now, I realized something. They were already uncomfortable. They were already unraveling. And for once, it wasn't me shrinking in my chair. It was them. Mark reached for my hand, his fingers warm, steady. He didn't squeeze hard, didn't push me forward. He just reminded me, with that simple touch, that I had a choice. For the first time, I felt the weight of years of silence sliding off my shoulders. I didn't have to be the quiet daughter anymore. I didn't have to carry their shame as if it belonged to me. Mark's voice softened, but it carried across the table. "You've called me the help. That's fine. But know this, I've been helping this family in ways you'll never admit. And I'll keep doing what's right, whether you respect me or not. Because respect isn't what makes a man. Integrity does." The words settled into the night air, final and unshakable. I looked at him then, and pride swelled inside me like a tide. This was the turning point, not just for Mark, but for me. Because for the first time, I knew I was ready. Ready to speak. Ready to break the silence. Ready to tell them the truth they had never wanted to hear. For years, I had promised myself I wouldn't stir the pot, that keeping the peace was better than starting a fight. But as I sat at that table, with Mark's steady hand in mine and the weight of his words filling the silence, I knew it was time. My father's face was flushed, his jaw clenched tight, ready to spit another insult. My mother's fingers toyed with her wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin, nervous line. Vera stared at her lap, her perfect posture beginning to collapse under the pressure. The silence stretched long, heavy, almost unbearable. And then, for the first time in years, I found my voice. I placed my napkin gently on the table, pressing my trembling hands flat to steady them. "I need to say something," I began. My voice was soft, but it carried, slicing through the still air. My father scoffed. "Here we go," my brother muttered under his breath, rolling his eyes. But I didn't let them stop me. Not this time. "I've stayed quiet my whole life," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Every insult, every laugh at my expense, every time you called me a failure," I swallowed it. I told myself it was for the family. I told myself silence meant peace. I looked directly at my father. But the truth is, that peace was only for you. For all of you. It was never peace for me. The air thickened. Forks froze mid-air. Even the cicadas seemed to fade into the background. "I was the one who sat by Dad's hospital bed every weekend after surgery," I continued. "I was the one who drove Mom to the doctor when she could barely walk last winter. I was the one who showed up again and again, even when you made it clear I wasn't welcome." My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the people who had defined me for too long. "And yet you sit here, calling me a disgrace, mocking the man who has stood by me, the man who has helped you more than you'll ever admit." My brother laughed under his breath. "Come on, Susan." "He's just a handyman," I turned to him, my anger finally breaking through the fear. "You mean the handyman who fixed the lake house you've been bragging about for years? The one you take your friends to, pretending it's yours to show off?" His smirk faltered. He shifted in his chair, glancing at his wife, who avoided his eyes. My father slammed his hand against the table, silverware jumping with the force. "Enough, Susan!" But the word no longer carried weight. Not for me. "No," I said, louder now. "Not enough." Not anymore. I felt years of swallowed words rising in my chest, and for once I let them out. I am not ashamed of my husband. I am not ashamed of the life we've built. I am ashamed that it took me this long to see the truth about this family. My mother finally looked up, her eyes glassy but her mouth still sealed shut. Her loyalty, as always, was to silence. I turned back to my father, whose face was red with fury. "You remember when Grandpa passed? When you swore you'd keep his land in the family?" He froze. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the fear he tried to mask. "You almost lost it," I said quietly but firmly. "You borrowed against it to cover your debts. And when the taxes piled up, you pretended everything was fine. Do you know who paid them, Dad? Do you know who saved that land for you?" The silence was sharp, cutting through the humid air. My father's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no defense. "It was Mark," I said, "the man you mock, the man you call beneath us. He saved what you nearly lost." The table was still, all eyes on me now, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with something else. Unease. "I'm done being your scapegoat," I continued, my voice steadier now than it had ever been. "I'm done swallowing my voice to protect your pride. You don't get to decide who I am anymore." I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood against stone echoing like a declaration. For the first time in years, I stood tall in front of them. My hands still shook, but inside something stronger had taken root. Pride, clarity, freedom. Mark's hand slipped into mine, warm and steady. The man they had mocked, the man they had underestimated, had given me the strength to speak. But the words were mine. Finally, mine. The silence that followed wasn't heavy with shame anymore. It was filled with the weight of truth. Truth they couldn't laugh away. Truth they couldn't silence. And I knew in that moment, nothing at this table would ever be the same. Part 6. The Confrontation. The silence around the patio thickened until it felt like a storm pressing against my chest. My father's eyes burned into me, sharp and unforgiving, but I didn't flinch. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter who swallowed her words to keep the peace. I was a woman, standing on her own ground. "You think you can come in here and humiliate us?" Dad's voice cracked through the night like thunder. "You've forgotten where you come from." I lifted my chin. "No, I've remembered exactly where I come from, and I've decided I won't live in silence anymore." Gasps rustled around the table. My aunt clutched her pearls. My brother muttered a curse, and Vera's face hardened like porcelain. My mother, usually quick with her sharp little remarks, said nothing. Her glass trembled slightly as she set it down. "You're making a scene," Vera hissed, her voice low but cutting. "Do you know how embarrassing this is for us?" "For you," I corrected, my voice steady, "not for me." Mark's hand tightened around mine, his quiet strength holding me steady as the waves of outrage rippled across the table. Dad leaned forward, his face red, his voice rising. "You've always been ungrateful. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" I shook my head slowly. "You didn't give me everything. You gave me conditions, expectations, rules about what love should look like, what respect should mean, what success had to be. And when I didn't fit that mold, you called me a disgrace." My mother finally spoke, her voice softer than I expected. "We only wanted what was best for you, Susan." I met her eyes, and for the first time, I didn't look away. "No, you wanted what looked best for you, and I carried that weight for too long." The words hung in the warm air, sharp as glass, and for once, no one laughed them off. Even my brother, quick with his mocking tone, sat still, his smirk gone. Mark released my hand only long enough to set his rag back in his pocket. Then he stood beside me. "Susan doesn't owe you silence anymore," he said quietly. "She owes herself the truth." The tension snapped like a rope pulled too tight. My father slammed his palm against the table, but the sound didn't shake me anymore. I felt taller, stronger, as if years of silence had cracked and fallen away like broken chains. "This dinner is over," Dad barked. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back." For a moment, the old fear tugged at me. The fear of losing family, of being cast out, of standing truly alone. But when I looked at Mark, steady and calm, I knew the truth. I wasn't losing anything. I was freeing myself. I reached for his hand. Then we'll go. The room stilled, the finality of my words echoing louder than any argument. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for their approval. I stood, Mark beside me, and walked away from the table that had defined me for too long. Behind me, I heard whispers, a chair scrape, my mother's soft, broken exhale. But I didn't turn back. Not this time. The night air wrapped around me as I stepped off the patio, warm and heavy, but for the first time in years, I could breathe. The cicadas sang louder, the stars above seemed clearer, and the weight that had pressed on my chest for so long was gone. Mark opened the truck door for me. I slid in, my hands still trembling, but not from fear. From release. From relief. From something I could only describe as freedom. When the engine rumbled to life, I expected to feel small, fragile after what had just happened. Instead, I felt expansive, like I'd finally stepped out of a cage I hadn't even realized was locked. The chains of silence, of trying to be the daughter they wanted, were gone. Mark drove without speaking, his hand resting over mine on the seat. The road stretched ahead of us, dark and endless, but for the first time I didn't dread what lay beyond. I welcomed it. "You okay?" he asked softly, his eyes on the road but his voice full of care. I let out a shaky laugh. "No, better than okay. For once I feel alive." We passed rows of houses, glowing with their perfect lawns and spotless driveways, but I didn't feel envy anymore. My life wasn't polished, wasn't wrapped in crystal glasses and perfect name cards, but it was mine, and it was real. Mark pulled the truck onto the highway, the hum of the tires steady beneath us. "They'll talk," he said. "They'll twist it, say what they want." I turned to him, squeezing his hand. "Let them. Their story isn't mine anymore." Silence filled the cab, but it wasn't the heavy silence of my family's table. It was peaceful, healing, a silence that felt like possibility. The miles slipped by, and I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself, trying to fit into a family that measured love by status and success. Tonight I had finally said the words that had been caged in me for so long, and in speaking them, I had set myself free. Mark glanced at me, that crooked smile tugging at his lips. "So, where to now?" I laughed again, the sound bubbling out of me like I hadn't heard in years. "Anywhere, everywhere, as long as it's with you." The road stretched forward, wide and open, the horizon waiting. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't defined by their judgment or confined by their silence. I was my own, and I was free. As the truck carried us into the night, I leaned my head against Mark's shoulder and closed my eyes. The stars above shimmered, the air rushed cool through the open window, and my heart beat steady with a truth I would never let go of again. Silence is not peace. Truth is. And I had finally chosen mine. Susan's story isn't just about a family dinner. It's about the journey of reclaiming her own voice. Sometimes we stay silent to keep the peace, but silence carried too long becomes chains that hold us down. Only when we dare to speak the truth and choose our own path can we truly be free. If you've ever felt judged or made to feel less, remember, your worth does not come from the eyes of others. It comes from living true to yourself. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the message. And remember, your love, your truth, your place are worth defending.